The year is 336 BC. The most powerful man in the Greek world is walking down an aisle. Not a battlefield, a wedding aisle. He is laughing. His bodyguards have been ordered to stay back. A deliberate show of confidence, of power, of untouchability. Thousands of eyes are on him. White robes, flowers, music. The scent of incense hanging over the theatre of Aegae like a funeral shroud. And then, a single figure breaks from the crowd. A blade catches the morning light for exactly half a second, and the man who conquered Greece, who bribed a continent, who lost an eye taking a city and kept marching, who engineered the most terrifying war machine the ancient world had ever seen, that man drops to the stone floor like a sack of grain. Dead before the echo of the screaming crowd even reaches the back rows, his name was Philip II of Macedon. And almost nobody talks about him. They talk about his son. They always talk about his son. But here is the brutal truth. Alexander the Great did not build the army that conquered the known world. He inherited it. Every tactic, every weapon, every corrupted official and broken alliance. That was Philip's work. Philip's genius. Philip's obsession. Alexander was the arrow. Philip built the bow. This is the story of a teenage hostage who studied his captors like a scientist studying specimens in a jar, who went home, tore his own kingdom's military down to the studs, and rebuilt it as something the world had genuinely never seen, who married 7 women, most of those marriages cold, calculated diplomatic instruments, each one a treaty sealed in flesh, who once said, and ancient sources preserve this, that a donkey loaded with gold could take any fortress that a battering ram could not. This is the story of the man who made Alexander possible, and it ends with a knife at a wedding. Stay with me. Before we go any further, if you are new here, this channel exists to tell the stories that history textbooks bury in footnotes. The real stories, the brutal ones. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications because we go deep on this channel and you do not want to miss what comes next. And if you already know Philip deserves more credit than he gets, hit that like button right now. It tells the algorithm that this story matters. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Macedonia, 4th century BC, a kingdom bleeding from every border. The great Greek city-states, Athens with her silver tongue, Sparta with her iron spine, Thebes riding the peak of a military revolution. They looked north at Macedonia the way wolves look at a wounded animal, and they were not wrong to. Philip's father, Amyntas III, had spent most of his reign simply keeping the kingdom from being swallowed whole by Illyrian raiders from the west and Thracian warbands from the east. The royal court in Pella was a den of backstabbing rival claimants and foreign interference so relentless it reads less like a palace and more like a pressure cooker someone forgot to watch. Then Philip's brother, King Perdiccas III, rode out to fight the Illyrians in 359 BC and never came back. 4,000 Macedonian soldiers died with him. The army was shattered. The treasury was a bad joke. Athens was already backing a rival claimant to the throne. The Illyrians were massing for what they assumed would be the killing blow. By any rational accounting, Macedonia had months, maybe weeks, before it simply ceased to exist. Philip was 23 years old. What nobody in Athens or Thebes or Sparta bothered to calculate was where Philip had spent the 3 years before all of this. Around 368 BC, at roughly 14 or 15 years old, he had been sent to Thebes as a political hostage. Standard ancient practice, a royal son handed over as a living guarantee of good faith between kingdoms. He was housed with a prominent Theban family, educated, given access to the city's intellectual and military life. On the surface, a comfortable captivity. In practice, an accident of history that would reshape the ancient world. Because Thebes in 368 BC was not just any city. It was the most militarily advanced civilization in Greece, commanded by a general named Epaminondas, a man so tactically innovative that even his enemies wrote about him with barely concealed awe. Ancient tradition holds that Philip absorbed firsthand the military revolution Epaminondas was conducting, concentrating crushing force on a single point of the enemy line rather than spreading evenly across the front. He would have observed, or at minimum studied closely, the sacred band of Thebes, an elite 300-man unit of paired warriors, bound by personal loyalty, virtually unbeatable in open-field combat. Whether Philip sat in on drills or learned through conversation and reputation, the influence is unmistakable in everything he later built. The old ways of Greek warfare were, at their core, a beautiful and elegant system for producing draws. Philip absorbed that lesson and resolved to build something that produced only victories. Most hostages count the days. Philip counted weaknesses. He went home to a kingdom on fire, and rather than panic, he moved with the cold, methodical precision of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. He bought time against immediate threats with diplomacy, bribery, and quick political maneuvering. He stabilized the court with ruthless speed, eliminating rival claimants before they could organize. And then, with whatever breathing room he had carved out of sheer nerve, he turned to the army. The broken, demoralized, traditionally organized Macedonian army that had just watched 4,000 of its men die in a single afternoon. He looked at it the way an engineer looks at a collapsed bridge, not with grief, with blueprints. What Philip built next was not just a better army, it was a fundamentally different kind of war machine, one built on year-round professional training, iron discipline, revolutionary weapons design, and a command philosophy that treated every soldier not as a disposable body, but as a precision instrument. The Greeks had been fighting wars the same way for 200 years. Philip was about to make all of it obsolete, and he was just getting started. Thebes, 368 BC. A 14-year-old boy arrives in a foreign city with nothing but his name and his eyes. The name means little here. Macedonia is a backwater, a buffer state. The Thebans who receive him are polite in the way powerful people are polite to the irrelevant. Cordial, unhurried, completely unintimidated. He is lodged with Pamenes, a prominent Theban general and close associate of the great Epaminondas himself. He is fed well. He attends the gymnasium. He is by every outward measure a guest rather than a prisoner. The Thebans have no reason to fear what is sitting at their dinner table. That was their first mistake. Philip did not arrive in Thebes as a student. He arrived as a spy, not in any formal sense. No one sent him with instructions, no one briefed him on what to look for. But something in the young Macedonian prince processed his surroundings with a quality of attention that bordered on predatory. He was not memorizing facts. He was reverse engineering a system, and the system he was watching was the finest military machine in the Greek world. Epaminondas was, by the mid-4th century BC, in the process of dismantling everything the Greeks thought they knew about warfare. The dominant model of Greek battle for centuries had been the hoplite phalanx, a wall of armoured citizen soldiers, shields locked, spears levelled, advancing in a roughly uniform line. It was brutal, honourable, and in a very specific way, deeply conservative. Both sides lined up, both sides pushed. The heavier, more disciplined side generally won. It was warfare as organised shoving match, and it had the elegant predictability of a ritual. Epaminondas looked at this ritual and saw a vulnerability hiding in plain sight. At the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, just 3 years before Philip arrived as a hostage, Epaminondas had shattered the Spartan army using a concept so simple it was almost insulting in retrospect. He stacked his left flank 50 shields deep instead of the conventional 8 to 12, concentrating an overwhelming mass of force at a single point, and sent it crashing into the Spartan right, where their best troops, their commanders, their entire psychological anchor stood. The Spartan line didn't bend. It snapped. In a single afternoon, the myth of Spartan invincibility, which had governed Greek political reality for over a century, was dead. Philip studied. Philip absorbed. Philip understood, or would come to understand, every dimension of what he was seeing. But he didn't just absorb Epaminondas' tactics. He looked deeper, at the infrastructure beneath the tactics, at what made Theban soldiers capable of executing that kind of disciplined, coordinated maneuver when every instinct in a battle line is screaming at you to slow down, spread out, and survive. The answer was the sacred band. 300 men, 150 pairs of lovers, bound together by personal devotion as much as military oath. The ancient sources, including Plutarch writing in his Life of Pelopidas, describe the sacred band as founded on the principle that a man will fight harder alongside his beloved than alongside a stranger. That shame and devotion are more powerful motivators than fear of an officer's punishment. They trained together constantly. They ate together. They slept in the same barracks. By the time they stood in a battle line, they were not a unit. They were a single organism with 300 bodies. Their cohesion was not enforced from above. It was generated from within. Philip stared at the sacred band the way a young architect stares at a building he's never seen before and thinks, I want to know every measurement of this. He spent approximately 3 years in Thebes, 3 years of watching, calculating, and slowly assembling in his mind a vision of what an army could be if you stripped away every assumption the Greeks had baked into the concept. What if soldiers were paid professionals rather than citizen farmers who went home after the summer campaign season? What if they trained year-round, in all weather, with weapons specifically engineered for the tactics you wanted to run? What if unit cohesion wasn't a happy accident, but a deliberately cultivated psychological condition? What if the Phalanx wasn't the whole army, but just one part of a combined system? A hammer working alongside a cavalry arm that acted as a blade. These were not idle thoughts. These were blueprints. When Philip returned to Macedonia around 365 BC, he did not immediately act on them. He couldn't. The kingdom was not yet his, and survival came before revolution. But when the throne collapsed into his hands in 359 BC, when the Illyrians were sharpening their spears and Athens was backing his rivals, and the Macedonian army lay in pieces, Philip did not reach for the conventional playbook. He reached for the blueprint he had been drawing in his head for nearly a decade. He called his soldiers together, not just the noble cavalry, who were the traditional backbone of Macedonian military power, but the ordinary infantry, the farmers and shepherds and craftsmen who had watched 4,000 of their countrymen get slaughtered. He looked at them the way Epaminondas must have looked at the Theban infantry before Leuctra, not as bodies to absorb punishment, as instruments to be sharpened. He told them things were going to change. He was not lying. The first thing Philip did was institute year-round training. In the Greek world, this was almost unheard of for infantry. Armies assembled, fought, and dispersed with the growing seasons. Philip ended that. His infantry would train in the summer, the autumn, the winter. They would march in full kit for distances that ancient sources describe as extraordinary. Polyaenus records that Philip required his men to carry 30 days of supplies on forced marches to eliminate the baggage train that slowed every Greek army to a crawl. They would learn to move fast, to hold formation under pressure, to trust the man beside them with the intimacy of soldiers who spend every waking hour together. And then he handed them a new weapon, the Sarissa, 18 feet of cornel wood and iron, tipped with an iron point, counterbalanced at the butt with a bronze spike that could be driven into the ground or used as a secondary weapon if the shaft broke. It was almost comically long by the standards of the day. The standard hoplite spear ran roughly 8 feet. The Sarissa was more than twice that. When a phalanx of men levelled their sarissas at the advanced position, the points of the 5th and 6th ranks of men projected beyond the front rank. An enemy charging into a Macedonian phalanx was not running at one spear. He was running at a forest of 5 overlapping walls of iron. The Sarissa changed everything about what infantry could do, but it came with a cost. The weapon was too long and too heavy to be wielded with a large shield. The Macedonian infantry carried a smaller round shield strapped to the forearm, freeing both hands for the pike. This made them almost entirely dependent on formation integrity. Break the formation, and the Sarissa phalanx was vulnerable, even catastrophically so. Philip knew this. He built his entire tactical system around protecting that vulnerability and exploiting the same vulnerability in every enemy he would ever face. Because the phalanx was not meant to win battles by itself. It was meant to fix them, pin the enemy, hold them in place, make them commit, make them push forward into that wall of iron and die by inches while their flanks are exposed and wondering where the real blow is coming from. And then, from the right flank, from the angle the enemy never quite manages to cover, the Companion Cavalry hits like a thunderbolt. Philip's cavalry, the Hetairoi, the Companions, were already the most prestigious element of Macedonian military tradition. Noble Macedonians had always fought on horseback, but Philip reorganized them, re-equipped them, and gave them a doctrine. They would not hover at the edges and skirmish. They would charge, hard, at the decisive point, at exactly the moment the enemy line was locked in the grinding horror of the Sarissa phalanx and could not reorient fast enough to respond. The companions carried a shorter spear, the xyston, and rode in a wedge formation that concentrated the momentum of the charge on a single point. Like a spear thrown by the phalanx itself, it was, in the clearest possible terms, the system Epaminondas had used at Leuctra. One part of the line fixes the enemy, another part destroys them. But Philip had scaled it, professionalized it, and built it into an army that could sustain the approach across multiple years and multiple campaigns, rather than relying on a single moment of tactical inspiration. Epaminondas had discovered the principle. Philip turned it into an institution. By 358 BC, just 1 year into his reign, Philip tested his new machine against the Illyrians who had killed his brother and devastated his army. The Battle of the Lyncestian Field was not close. The Illyrians, who had fought traditional tribal warfare their entire lives, had no framework for what was coming at them. The Sarissa phalanx locked them in place. The Companion Cavalry hit their flank. Over 7,000 Illyrian warriors died. The northwestern threat to Macedonia was, for the first time in living memory, gone. Philip was 24 years old. He had been king for exactly 1 year. He looked south, toward Greece, toward the city-states that had dismissed Macedonia as a frontier nuisance for generations, and the man who had spent 3 years in Thebes taking notes allowed himself what the sources suggest was a very rare luxury. He smiled. War in the ancient world had a rhythm, a seasonal pulse, as predictable as the harvest. Spring came. Farmers set down their ploughs, picked up their spears, and marched. They fought in the summer, brutal, sweaty, decisive engagements that rarely lasted more than a single afternoon. Then they went home. The grain needed harvesting, the olives needed pressing, the city needed its men back. Armies were not permanent institutions. They were temporary assemblies of citizens who happened to own armour, governed by the unspoken agreement that warfare should be expensive enough to matter, but short enough to survive. Philip looked at this system with the detached contempt of a man who had already decided to break it. The professional army Philip was building in the early 350s BC was not merely a military reform, it was a social revolution. He was creating something Macedonia had never had, and Greece had never truly imagined, a standing force of full-time soldiers whose identity, loyalty and livelihood were bound entirely to the king and the institution he commanded. These men did not go home after the summer. They trained in the autumn, they drilled in the winter, they marched in the rain and the snow carrying 30 days of rations on their backs, because Philip had decided very deliberately that a fast army with no baggage train was worth more than a comfortable army that moved at the speed of its supply wagons. Polyaenus, writing centuries later but drawing on earlier sources, records that Philip banned the use of wheeled transport on campaign entirely. No carts, no wagons. Soldiers carried their own equipment. Camp followers, the merchants, servants and hangers-on who bloated every Greek army into a slow, vulnerable procession, were dramatically reduced. One ancient account suggests Philip allowed 1 servant per 10 infantry soldiers, compared to the Greek norm of 1 per man. The result was an army that could cover ground at a pace that consistently shocked its enemies, arriving at positions before anyone had calculated it was possible. But speed was only one dimension of what Philip was engineering. The deeper transformation was psychological. He called his infantry the pegeteiroi, the foot companions. The word companion, heteros in Greek, carried enormous weight in Macedonian culture. It was the term used for the king's inner circle, his noble cavalry, his personal associates. By extending it to the infantry, Philip was doing something almost subversive. He was telling men who had always been the expendable mass of a battle line, the anonymous bodies who held the centre, while noble men on horseback won glory on the flanks, that they were his companions, his personal soldiers, members of his household in a cultural and emotional sense that went far beyond a paycheck. It was manipulation, yes, Philip was always manipulating. But it was also a genuine compact. He trained alongside his men. Ancient sources, including Frontini's in his Strategemata, note that Philip subjected himself to the same physical demands he placed on his soldiers, the same forced marches, the same rations, the same exposure to weather. He was not a general who commanded from a comfortable tent at the rear. He was a king who bled with his army, who took wounds, plural, documented severe wounds, in the same battles his soldiers fought. The loss of his eye at Methone, the wound to his collarbone from a Trebalian spear, the injury to his leg from an Illyrian assault. Philip's body, by the end of his life, was a map of the campaigns he had personally led from the front. This mattered enormously to the soldiers who served him. Loyalty was not abstract. It was earned, physically, in front of witnesses. Now, the weapon itself. The Sarissa deserves more time than it usually gets in popular histories, because it was not simply a longer spear. It was a piece of weapons engineering that cascaded through every aspect of how Macedonian infantry fought, moved and thought about their role in a battle. 18 feet. That is the figure most ancient sources converge on, with some accounts suggesting the longest versions reached 21 feet in Philip's later campaigns. The shaft was made of cornel wood, later sometimes ash or fir, dense, flexible, capable of absorbing the shock of impact without shattering on the first contact. The iron head at the front was leaf-shaped and socketed, designed to punch through bronze armour at the momentum of a massed advance. The bronze soriter, the butt spike, at the other end served multiple functions. It counterbalanced the weight of the head, allowing soldiers to hold the weapon horizontally for extended periods without their arms giving out. It could be driven into the ground to brace against a cavalry charge. And in the chaos of a collapsing phalanx, when the long shaft became a liability in close combat, the bronze spike became a secondary weapon, short, brutal, and immediately available. The Sarissa was carried in 2 sections and assembled before battle. This was not a flaw. It was a feature. A soldier marching 20 miles does not want to navigate an 18-foot pole through every narrow pass and river crossing. The 2-piece design made the weapon portable without sacrificing its devastating reach and formation. Now picture the formation itself, 8 ranks deep at minimum, often 16 during Philip's later campaigns. Every man's Sarissa points forward. The men in the first rank hold their weapons nearly horizontal. The second rank angles slightly higher, the third higher still. By the time you reach the 5th rank, the Sarissa tips are projecting beyond the front rank's shoulders, meaning an enemy facing this wall does not see one line of spear points. He sees 5 overlapping layers of iron. The men in ranks 6 through 8 hold their sarissas at a steep upward angle, acting as a kind of roof that catches and deflects missiles, arrows, javelins, before they reach the front ranks. Diodorus Siculus, describing Macedonian battlefield performance in his Library of History, captures something of the horror this formation produced in enemies encountering it for the first time. There was no gap to exploit, no individual soldier to isolate. The phalanx was not a group of men. It was a single instrument, a battering ram with 50 layers of iron on its face, advancing with the terrible grinding patience of a machine that does not feel fear. But Philip was too intelligent to stop there, because he already knew the phalanx weakness. He had designed it. A Sarissa phalanx was devastating on flat, open ground and almost useless on broken terrain. The formation demanded absolute cohesion. The moment it fragmented, the moment gaps opened between men, the long pikes became obstacles rather than weapons. An enemy who got inside the reach of the Sarissa was fighting men whose weapon was suddenly 18 feet of useless shaft dragging behind them. Philip's answer was the Companion Cavalry. The heteroi were organised into squadrons called Ile, each of roughly 200 horsemen drawn from the Macedonian nobility, and, increasingly, from allied Greek and Thessalian aristocrats whom Philip had politically absorbed into his orbit. They were equipped with the Xyston, a lance roughly 9 to 11 feet long, shorter and more manoeuvrable than the Sarissa, designed for the shock of a mounted charge rather than the sustained push of infantry combat. When the Xyston shattered on impact, as it often did, the companions drew swords and fought through. Their formation was the wedge, a triangle of horsemen with the squadron commander at the point, the most experienced riders filling out the edges, and the formation tapering back like an arrowhead. The wedge was designed to do one thing extraordinarily well: concentrate the entire momentum of a cavalry charge on a single point and punch through it before the enemy could respond. It was not subtle, it was not complicated, it was the ancient equivalent of a shaped charge, and it worked with terrifying consistency. The tactical marriage of the Sarissa phalanx and the Companion Cavalry was the core of what military historians now call the hammer and anvil. The phalanx was the anvil. It advanced, engaged the enemy's centre, pinned them in place, absorbed their attention, and held them there while the enemy commander's options progressively collapsed. The companions were the hammer, held back until the critical moment, then released at the weakest point of the enemy line, usually the flank or the junction between two units, with the full speed of a cavalry charge behind them. Philip did not invent cavalry. He did not invent the phalanx. What he invented was the doctrine. The precise coordination between the two arms, the timing, the communication, the command flexibility that allowed the hammer to fall at exactly the right moment. This required something most ancient armies completely lacked: a staff. Officers who understood the overall plan, who could read the battle as it developed, and make decisions without waiting for the king's explicit order. Philip trained these men as carefully as he trained his soldiers. The senior commanders of the Macedonian army were not simply brave noblemen. They were military professionals who could execute a complex, multi-phase tactical plan in the chaos of a real battle. And then there was the siege train. This is where Philip departed most dramatically from anything the Greek world had previously attempted at scale. Greek city-states were protected by walls. Walls had always been the great equalizer. A small garrison behind stone could hold off a much larger force indefinitely, waiting for relief, waiting for hunger to do its work on the besieging army. Philip changed that equation by investing heavily in siege engineering. Catapults, torsion artillery, siege towers, and the technical specialists to operate them. Polyaenus and Diodorus both record Philip using artillery in sieges that Greek commanders of the previous generation would have simply waited out. The most famous, and personally costly, demonstration of this capability came at the city of Macedon in 354 BC. Philip was directing the siege personally, close to the walls, watching the operation unfold when an archer named Aster, likely Olynthian, drew his bow and put an arrow directly through Philip's right eye. Philip did not die, he lost the eye. Surgeons removed it. The socket healed badly. The disfigurement was permanent and severe. Ancient sources record that he kept the arrow. He had it inscribed and stored it as a trophy, a reminder perhaps of the cost of standing too close to the work. Some historians interpret this as evidence of Philip's almost pathological fearlessness. Others read it as theatre, a calculated projection of invincibility to his troops and his enemies. With Philip, the line between genuine psychology and deliberate performance was always thin. Macedon fell. Philip took it apart stone by stone, expelled its population, and gave the land to his Macedonian soldiers. The message was not subtle. Resist Philip, and you cease to exist. By the mid-350s BC, Philip had also acquired something that would multiply every other advantage he possessed. In 357 BC, he seized the city of Amphipolis in Thrace, which Athens had been trying to recover for decades. Amphipolis sat at the edge of Mount Pangaeon, and Mount Pangaeon sat on top of one of the richest gold and silver deposits in the ancient Greek world. The ancient sources are specific about the scale of this windfall. Ancient sources record that the mines around Philippi and Mount Pangaeon eventually produced revenues of about 1,000 talents a year for Philip's treasury. To put that in context, the entire annual tribute of the Athenian Empire at its height had been approximately 600 talents. Philip now had a treasury that dwarfed the wealthiest city-state in Greece, and he put every coin of it to work with the same disciplined intentionality he brought to everything else. He built his army, he built his siege equipment, he built roads and ports and the infrastructure of a kingdom that was rapidly outgrowing its borders, and he spent a very large amount of gold on something that did not appear in any military inventory, but that Philip considered as essential as any weapon in his arsenal. He spent it on people, not their loyalty. Philip was too clear-eyed for that. He spent it on their interests, on the specific, carefully calculated point at which a man's ambitions and Philip's ambitions could be made to overlap. The donkey loaded with gold was not a bribe in the crude sense. It was a precision instrument of political engineering, and Philip was about to deploy it against the most sophisticated political culture in the ancient world. Greece never saw it coming. Philip built his power by controlling information, knowing what enemies knew, hiding his own plans, and moving faster than anyone could react. In the modern world, the principle is the same. Your browsing activity, location, and personal data are exposed far more often than most people realize. NordVPN encrypts your connection, hides your IP address, and helps protect your data whether you're on public Wi-Fi, traveling, or just tired of constant tracking. Use the link in the description to get the best current offer and extra months when available. Philip used gold to control the ancient world. Use NordVPN to control your own digital one. Check the link in description below. There is a line, preserved in the ancient sources and attributed to Philip himself, that tells you everything you need to know about how this man thought. No city is impregnable if you can get a donkey loaded with gold inside its gates. It is funny, almost. The kind of line that sounds almost harmless until you think about what it really means. But sit with it for a moment and let the coldness of it settle in. Philip is not talking about buying a city's defenders. He's talking about something far more systematic. The deliberate, patient, long-term corruption of an enemy's political class until the enemy's own institutions become the mechanism of their defeat. He's describing a strategy in which the war is won before the army ever marches, in which the decisive battlefield is not a plain outside a city, but a council chamber inside it, and the decisive weapon is not a Sarissa, but an envelope of silver passed beneath a table at a dinner party. Philip ran this strategy against Greece for 20 years, and it worked almost perfectly. To understand why Greece was so vulnerable to it, you have to understand what Greek political culture actually looked like in the mid-4th century BC. The city-states were not a unified nation. They were a collection of intensely proud, mutually suspicious, perpetually competing polities that had spent the better part of 2 centuries alternately fighting each other and forming temporary alliances against whichever city had most recently become too powerful. Athens, Sparta, and Thebes had each, in turn, achieved something close to Greek hegemony, and each time the other city-states had combined to tear them back down. The system was almost perfectly designed to prevent any single power from dominating, but it was equally designed to prevent any coordinated response to an outside threat that moved faster than the city-states could argue with each other. Philip understood this with the clarity of a man who had studied these cities from the inside. He had lived in Thebes. He had watched Athenian ambassadors come and go. He had observed at close range the way factional politics within a city could paralyze its foreign policy for months, while the world changed around it. Every Greek city had a pro-Macedonian faction and an anti-Macedonian faction. Philip cultivated the former, undermined the latter, and played the tension between them with the patience of a man who knew that time was always on his side. His tool was gold. His method was relationships. His genius was specificity. Philip did not simply shower money on Greek politicians and hope for the best. He identified in each city the specific individuals whose influence was large, whose ambitions were unsatisfied, and whose price, not necessarily in silver, sometimes in land, in political support, in a favourable trade agreement, in the return of a hostage son, could be calculated and met. He built networks of obligation across the Greek world, quietly, over years, so that by the time his army moved toward a particular city, the political ground had already been prepared. The gates were not always open, but the men who controlled them were frequently uncertain, divided, or quietly hoping Philip would win quickly and cleanly, so they could position themselves on the right side of the outcome. Demosthenes saw all of this with a clarity that was almost agonizing, and the tragedy of his position was that seeing it clearly was not the same as being able to stop it. Demosthenes was Athens' greatest orator, and in the 350s and 340s BC, he devoted the full power of that gift to a single purpose: warning Athens about Philip of Macedon. His speeches, the Philippics as they came to be known, a word that has entered the English language as a synonym for passionate denunciation, are extraordinary documents, not just as rhetoric, but as political analysis. Demosthenes understood Philip's strategy at a structural level. He told the Athenian assembly repeatedly that Philip's gold was more dangerous than his spears. He told them that every city Philip had taken, he had taken first by corrupting its politics. He told them that the window to act was closing, that every season of inaction was a season Philip used to advance, consolidate, and prepare for the next move. The Athenian assembly listened to him beautifully. They applauded, they passed resolutions, and then they largely went home and did very little. This was not simple cowardice. Athens in the 350s BC was exhausted from decades of costly wars, financially stretched, and deeply skeptical of any policy that would require significant sacrifice from its citizens. Philip was also careful, during this period, to frame his aggression in terms that gave Athens political cover for inaction. Each individual move he made could be justified, minimized, or explained away. He wasn't attacking Greece, he was dealing with a local dispute in Thessaly. He wasn't threatening Athens, he was simply recovering territory that had historically belonged to Macedonia. The whole was a systematic conquest. The individual pieces looked like border adjustments. This is where the 7 marriages become essential to understanding Philip's strategy, because they were not romantic. They were not even primarily dynastic in the conventional sense. Each marriage was a precision diplomatic instrument, a treaty sealed in flesh, a network node in the web Philip was weaving across the northern Greek world. His first wife, Phila of Elymiotis, secured peace with a powerful Macedonian noble house that could have been a source of internal opposition. His marriage to Audata, an Illyrian princess, put a formal seal on the peace with the Illyrians following his crushing victory over them in 358 BC. The same Illyrians who had killed his brother. His marriage to Philina of Larissa was part of his absorption of Thessaly, the most powerful cavalry-producing region in Greece, whose horsemen would eventually ride alongside the companions in every major campaign. His marriage to Nicesipolis of Pherae reinforced his political control over Thessaly further. His marriage to Medea of Odessos extended his diplomatic reach into the Thracian kingdoms to the northeast. And then there was Olympias. The marriage to Olympias of Epirus, princess of the Molossian kingdom on Macedonia's western border, was arguably the most consequential political alliance Philip ever forged, and certainly the most personally explosive. Epirus was not as powerful as Thessaly, or as prestigious as Athens, but it controlled Macedonia's western flank, and an unfriendly Epirus was a permanent strategic liability. Philip met Olympias on the island of Samothrace, at a religious festival, around 357 BC. Ancient sources, Plutarch among them, describe their connection as immediate and intense, the kind of charged mutual recognition that bypasses calculation and operates on something more primal. Philip married her, she bore him Alexander in 356 BC, and a daughter, Cleopatra of Macedon, shortly after. From the beginning, the relationship between Philip and Olympias was a power struggle dressed as a marriage. Olympias was not a woman who accepted a subordinate position quietly. She was fiercely intelligent, politically ambitious, and possessed of what the ancient sources describe, with barely concealed alarm, as a passionate, almost ecstatic religious devotion. She was a dedicated initiate of Dionysiac mystery cults, and Plutarch records that she kept tame snakes in her bedroom as part of her religious practice, a habit that Philip found increasingly unsettling. She was also, from the moment Alexander was born, absolutely consumed by her son's destiny. She told Alexander stories. She filled his head with divine ancestry, that his true father was not Philip but Zeus himself, or perhaps Achilles through her own lineage. She built in Alexander a sense of exceptional destiny that Philip's complicated, often cold relationship with his son did nothing to counterbalance. Philip's marriages were multiplication, each one expanding his network, his territory, his options. But Olympias was different. Olympias was a variable he could not fully control, and Philip, a man who had built his entire career on controlling variables, found that deeply uncomfortable. We will return to Olympias. History demands it. In the meantime, Philip's campaign of silver and diplomacy was reaching its operational peak in the late 350s and early 340s BC, and its most dramatic theatre was the conflict that historians call the Third Sacred War. In 356 BC, the Phocians, a Greek state in central Greece, seized the sanctuary of Delphi and began using its vast treasury to fund a mercenary army. This was sacrilege of the highest order in the Greek religious framework, and it triggered a war between the Phocians and the Amphictyonic League, a religious council that oversaw the sanctuary. The Thessalians, who were league members, called on Philip for help. Philip responded with enthusiasm that had nothing to do with religious piety, and everything to do with the strategic opportunity being handed to him on a silver platter. Intervening in the sacred war gave Philip a legitimate Greek-sanctioned reason to march his army deep into central Greece. It wrapped his expansion in the respectable language of religious duty rather than naked conquest. It made him, in the eyes of many Greek states, a defender of sacred values rather than an aggressor. And when the war concluded in 346 BC, With Philip presiding over the settlement at the Peace of Philocrates, he had achieved something that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Macedonia was now a member of the Amphictyonic League. A Macedonian king now held a permanent seat in the council that governed the most important religious institution in the Greek world. Philip had not just entered Greek politics, he had inserted himself into its sacred architecture. Demosthenes was beside himself. He stood in the Athenian assembly and delivered the Third Philippic in 341 BC, one of the most powerful political speeches to survive from antiquity, and told the Athenians in terms that could not be misunderstood that Philip was not their ally, not their friend, not a fellow Greek acting in the common interest, but a conqueror who was methodically dismantling their freedom, using their own institutions and their own greed as tools. He said Philip's agents were in every city. He said the gold of Mount Pangaion was buying the future of Greece one politician at a time. He was right about all of it. And Athens finally began to listen. In 340 BC, Philip made a move that even his most ardent Athenian sympathizers could not rationalize away. He besieged Perinthus and Byzantium, cities on the Bosphorus that controlled Athens' vital grain supply route from the Black Sea. Without that grain, Athens could not feed its population. Philip had moved from political maneuvering to existential threat, and Athens responded by declaring war. The Athenians sent a fleet. They rallied allies. Demosthenes worked with extraordinary energy to build a coalition that included, crucially, Thebes. The same Thebes whose military genius Philip had absorbed as a teenager, now standing against him as an adversary. It was a remarkable diplomatic achievement, and Philip recognized it as such. He recognized it as the moment when the long game of silver and patience had reached its limit, and the army he had spent 20 years building would have to finish what the gold had started. He chose his ground, he chose his moment, and he chose for the decisive blow a weapon he had been sharpening for 18 years, his son. August 338 BC, the plain of Chaeronea, in the Greek region of Boeotia. Our ancient sources for this battle are thinner than the scale of its consequences deserves. Diodorus is brief, other accounts fragmentary. What follows is the reconstruction that most modern military historians accept, though some details remain debated. A flat stretch of ground, bounded by the Cephissus River to the north and a line of low hills to the south. Not dramatic terrain. Not the kind of landscape that announces itself as the stage for a civilization-defining moment. Just a wide, hot, late summer plain. The kind of ground farmers work and shepherds cross without a second thought. In a few hours, it will be soaked in blood, and the political map of the entire Greek world will be permanently redrawn. Philip chose this ground. He always chose his battlefields carefully. The allied Greek force facing him was the largest coalition the city-states had assembled in a generation. Athens had contributed its citizen hoplites, proud, historically conscious men carrying the memory of Marathon and Salamis like a physical weight on their shoulders, the living inheritance of the city that had once turned back Persia. Thebes had contributed its professional infantry and, at the centre of their line, the sacred band, the 300 paired warriors who had never been broken in battle, who had destroyed the myth of Spartan invincibility at Leuctra, who were, by any honest assessment, the finest infantry unit in the Greek world. Together, the Allied force numbered somewhere between 30 and 35,000 men. Philip's army was comparable in size. Ancient sources give figures between 30 and 40,000. But the composition was fundamentally different. The Allies were a coalition, two separate armies from two separate cities, with two separate command structures, two separate tactical traditions, and the kind of coordination problems that coalitions always produce. Philip's army was a single instrument, built over 2 decades to function as a unified system under a single command will. The Allies deployed with the Athenians on their left flank, anchored against the Cephissus River, and the Thebans on their right, their flank resting against the lower slopes of the hills. The sacred band held the rightmost position of the Theban line, the post of honour, the position where the hardest fighting was expected, the place where the best troops went. Between the Athenians and Thebans, allied contingents from Corinth, Megara, Achaea, and other states filled out the centre. Philip took the right of his own line, opposite the Athenians, personally. He placed Alexander, 18 years old, commanding the Companion Cavalry for the first time in a major engagement, on the left, directly opposite the sacred band. Let that sit for a moment. Philip looked at the most dangerous military unit in the Greek world, the formation that had broken Sparta, the 300 men who had never been defeated, and he pointed his teenage son at them. This was not recklessness. This was the coldest, most calculated decision Philip made in a career defined by cold calculation. He knew Alexander. He had watched his son train, ride, and think about warfare with the same obsessive intensity Philip himself possessed. He had given Alexander the best military education available. Aristotle had tutored the boy's mind, but Philip had personally tutored his military instincts, taking him on campaign, exposing him to command decisions, letting him watch and learn and internalize. Alexander, at 18, was not a boy playing soldier. He was the product of 18 years of deliberate preparation, and Philip knew exactly what he had made. More importantly, Philip understood the sacred band's weakness in a way that no one had yet managed to exploit. Their strength was their cohesion, their willingness to die for each other, their absolute refusal to break under frontal pressure. But they were infantry, and against a properly executed cavalry charge at the right angle and the right moment, even the sacred band's legendary cohesion had a physical limit. The battle opened in the standard fashion, lines advancing, javelins thrown, the grinding noise of shields and spears as the front ranks made contact across the line. And then Philip did something that shocked the Athenians and has fascinated military historians ever since. He retreated, not a rout, not a collapse. A controlled, disciplined, step-by-step withdrawal of his right wing, the Macedonian infantry opposite the Athenians, backward and to the right, pulling the Athenian line forward, stretching it, drawing the Athenians out of their original position, with the irresistible momentum of men who believe they are winning. The Athenian general Stratocles, according to Diodorus, reportedly shouted to his men to press forward that they were pushing the Macedonians back to Macedonia itself. The Athenian line surged. This is one of the most audacious maneuvers in ancient military history, and it required something almost impossible to manufacture: the ability to get thousands of soldiers to perform a controlled retreat under battle conditions without it becoming a real retreat. Philip's men had been trained for years to execute precisely this kind of disciplined movement. They stepped back in formation, sarissas levelled, maintaining their cohesion, giving ground deliberately while the Athenians chased what they thought was a breaking enemy line. The Athenians pressed forward, and as they did, a gap opened. A gap between the left edge of the Athenian line and the right edge of the Theban line. The two wings of the allied coalition moving at different speeds, the Athenians surging forward, the Thebans and the sacred band holding their ground against the Macedonian left, began to separate. A space appeared in the allied centre, growing wider with every step the Athenians took forward. Philip had been waiting for exactly this gap. He had, in fact, engineered it. The signal went out. Alexander moved. The Companion Cavalry came off the left flank of the Macedonian line in their wedge formation, at full gallop, aimed directly at the gap in the allied centre and the exposed flank of the sacred band. Alexander was at the point of the wedge. Ancient sources preserve the impression of something almost overwhelming about the speed and violence of that charge, the thundering mass of horsemen concentrating their entire momentum on a single point in the enemy line. The sacred band turned to face it. They did what they had always done. They held. They tightened their formation, locked shields, levelled spears, and prepared to absorb the charge the way they had absorbed every charge that had ever been thrown at them. They were the sacred band of Thebes. They did not break. They died. Alexander's cavalry hit the flank of the Theban line and drove through it like a wedge-splitting timber. The Companion Cavalry broke the line of the sacred band, surrounded them, and killed them where they stood. All 300 of them, not one ran. Plutarch, in his Life of Pelopidas, records that when the bodies were recovered after the battle, all 300 were found in their positions, facing the enemy, with wounds on the front of their bodies. Not one had turned to flee. Whether this is precise historical record or noble legend built around the event, it captures the truth of what the sacred band were. Plutarch, writing in his Life of Pelopidas, records that Philip himself visited the site where the sacred band fell, and upon being told they were the paired lovers who had sworn to die together rather than surrender, wept. Whether this is accurate or constructed sentiment, it tells us something about how the ancient world processed what had happened at Chaeronea. Even Philip's victory over the sacred band was understood as something that required mourning, not just celebration. A thing of terrible beauty had been destroyed. While Alexander was destroying the Theban rite, Philip's controlled withdrawal had completed its second phase. The Athenians, who had charged forward in pursuit of what they thought was a breaking Macedonian line, now found themselves overextended, separated from their Theban allies, fighting on ground they had not chosen, against an infantry line that suddenly stopped retreating and drove back into them with the full weight of the Sarissa Phalanx. The Macedonian right, which had been giving ground so deliberately, reversed direction and hammered forward. The Athenians, their formation disordered by the pursuit, their flanks exposed, and their Theban allies gone, collapsed. The battle lasted, by ancient accounts, a matter of hours. When it ended, the allied coalition was shattered. Over 1,000 Athenians were dead. 2,000 more were captured. The Thebans had suffered devastating losses. The sacred band was annihilated to the last man. The plain of Chaeronea was covered in the wreckage of Greek military power, and Philip of Macedon stood in the middle of it as the undisputed master of Greece. He was 44 years old. Ancient sources record that Philip celebrated with considerable enthusiasm that evening, perhaps too much enthusiasm. Theopompus and other sources describe him walking among the battlefield dead, drunk, mocking the fallen Athenians. Demades, an Athenian prisoner, reportedly told Philip to his face that he was playing the role of Thersites, the fool of the Iliad, when he could be playing Agamemnon. Philip, to his credit, was sober enough to recognize the rebuke. He pulled himself together, released the Athenian prisoners without ransom, and treated the defeated city-states with a restraint that surprised everyone. There was calculation in this restraint, as there was calculation in everything Philip did. He did not want to rule a resentful, occupied Greece. He wanted a willing, or at least acquiescent, coalition for the campaign he was already planning. Because Chaeronea was not the goal. Chaeronea was the preparation. The goal was Persia. In 337 BC, Philip convened the League of Corinth, a congress of all Greek states except Sparta, which refused to join and was conspicuously left outside. Every member swore an oath of mutual defence and pledged military contributions to a joint pan-Hellenic campaign against the Persian Empire. Philip was named hegemon, supreme commander. The war of revenge for Persia's invasion of Greece, 150 years earlier, was officially announced. Philip had done it. In 23 years he had taken a broken, besieged, nearly extinct Macedonian kingdom and made it the undisputed ruler of the Greek world. The army was built, the alliances were secured, the treasury was full, the plan was ready. And then, with the most audacious campaign of his life about to begin, he went to a wedding, his own daughter's wedding, and someone brought a knife. 336 BC, Aigai, the ancient ceremonial capital of Macedonia. The city is dressed for celebration. Philip's daughter, Cleopatra of Macedon, not to be confused with the Egyptian queen born 2 centuries later, is marrying Alexander of Epirus, her maternal uncle and the Molossian king. It is a dynastic marriage, carefully arranged, sealing the alliance between Macedonia and Epirus that Philip had originally secured through his own marriage to Olympias nearly 2 decades earlier. The wedding is also something more than a wedding. It is a statement, a performance of power staged for an audience of Greek dignitaries, Macedonian nobles, foreign ambassadors, and the watching world. Philip understood theatre. He had always understood theatre. The celebrations were planned across multiple days. Banquets, athletic competitions, musical performances, and on the morning of the final day, a grand procession into the theatre of Aigi, where Philip planned to enter alone, deliberately, conspicuously alone, his bodyguards ordered to keep their distance, as a living demonstration of the confidence, the security, the untouchability of the man who had conquered Greece. Statues of the 12 Olympian gods were to be carried in procession ahead of him, and alongside them, a 13th statue, Philip himself, placed among the gods. This detail matters. Philip was not claiming divinity in the formal theological sense. He was making a political statement about his status, his achievement, his elevation above the ordinary run of kings and men. It was the kind of statement that played brilliantly to his Macedonian and Greek audience. It was also, in retrospect, the kind of hubris that Greek tragedy had been warning about for 200 years. He never reached his seat. A man named Pausanias stepped out of the crowd as Philip entered the theatre, drew a short blade and drove it into Philip's chest. The blow was precise and fatal. Philip II of Macedon, king of Macedonia, hegemon of the League of Corinth, architect of the most powerful military machine the ancient world had yet produced, died on the floor of a theatre at the age of 46. Pausanias ran. He had horses waiting, a prepared escape, evidence of planning rather than impulse. He was chased down and killed before he could reach them, cut down by Philip's bodyguards before he could be taken alive and questioned. That last detail is either a tragic accident of pursuit or the most consequential act of the entire conspiracy. Because Pausanias dead meant Pausanias silent, and with him died the one person who could have definitively answered the question that has haunted historians for 2,500 years: who ordered the hit? The ancient sources offer us not one answer but several, and they contradict each other in ways that are themselves revealing. Diodorus Siculus, our most detailed ancient source for Philip's assassination, gives us the personal motive first. Pausanias had been a member of Philip's inner circle, one of his personal bodyguards, a young man of good family who had enjoyed Philip's personal favour. He had been brutally gang assaulted on the orders of a Macedonian nobleman named Attalus, as revenge for an insult Pausanias had directed at another man. The details in Diodorus are graphic and deeply unpleasant. This was not a minor humiliation, but a severe, deliberately degrading act of violence. Pausanias had complained to Philip. Philip had sympathised, had given Pausanias gifts and promotion, but had done nothing to punish Attalus, because Attalus was the uncle of Philip's newest wife, and punishing him would have created a political crisis Philip preferred to avoid. The newest wife. This is where the story becomes genuinely explosive. In 337 BC, just 1 year before the assassination, Philip had taken a seventh wife. Her name was also Cleopatra, and she was a young Macedonian noblewoman, the niece of the general Attalus. Unlike Philip's previous marriages, which had been diplomatic instruments aimed at foreign powers, this marriage was purely personal, a late-life infatuation with a young woman from within the Macedonian nobility itself. Philip was in his mid-40s. She was a teenager. The marriage was a catastrophe for the court's existing power structure in ways that went far beyond simple jealousy. Philip's previous wives, including Olympias, had always been foreign princesses. Their sons, including Alexander, carried the disadvantage of mixed blood in the eyes of Macedonian aristocratic tradition. A Macedonian wife bearing a Macedonian son would produce an heir, whose claim to the throne was, by traditional Macedonian standards, cleaner than Alexander's. At the wedding feast, Attalus, drunk, triumphant, deeply stupid about the consequences of what he was saying, stood up and toasted the union, expressing the hope that it would produce a legitimate heir to the Macedonian throne. Alexander, sitting at the same table, hurled his cup at Attalus. Philip drew his sword and lurched across the table at his own son. He was drunk, he stumbled, he fell. Alexander looked down at his father on the floor and said, and Plutarch preserves this, chilling in its precision, "Here is the man who is preparing to cross from Europe to Asia, and he cannot even make it from one table to another." He and Olympias left Macedonia that night. Alexander fled to Epirus with his mother, and then, when Philip partially reconciled with him through the mediation of a mutual friend, to Illyria. The royal family of Macedonia was openly fractured, the succession was in genuine doubt, and the most dangerous woman in the ancient world was sitting in exile with her son, thinking. Olympias's role in the assassination is the deepest and most debated question in all of this. The ancient sources are divided, and their division is itself instructive. Plutarch raises the possibility of her involvement while declining to confirm it. Justin, the Roman historian drawing on earlier sources, states it as near certainty, claiming Olympias had encouraged Pausanias and had horses ready for his escape. Some later traditions, very far removed from the event itself, even claim that suspicions touched Alexander as well as Olympias. The circumstantial case against Olympias is powerful. She had been humiliated publicly by Philip's new marriage. Her son's succession was threatened. The man who had assaulted Pausanias, Attalus, was her direct enemy, the uncle of her replacement. She had motive, she had the court connections to organise a conspiracy, and she had a personality that every ancient source describes as fully capable of political violence. Plutarch records that after the assassination, Olympias had the new wife, Cleopatra Eurydice, as she was formerly known, and her infant daughter killed. She placed a gold crown on Pausanias's body, honouring him in death. These are not the actions of a grieving widow's ally, these are the actions of a woman settling accounts. The case against Alexander is thinner but impossible to dismiss entirely. He had every reason to want his father dead before Cleopatra Eurydice produced a male heir. He was present in Macedonia. He and Philip had partially reconciled in the months before the wedding, and Alexander attended the celebrations. He was, within hours of Philip's death, the uncontested king of Macedonia. The speed with which he consolidated power, eliminating potential rivals with ruthless efficiency, suggests either extraordinary preparation or a man who had thought very carefully about exactly this scenario. And yet, Philip had also made genuine enemies outside his own family. Attalus himself had reason to fear a Philip who might eventually act against him. The Persian court, facing the imminent Pan-Hellenic invasion Philip had announced, had both the motive and the resources to fund a conspiracy. Demosthenes in Athens knew of Philip's death before official messengers could have delivered the news, a detail that ancient sources noted and that has never been satisfactorily explained by coincidence alone. Pausanias was killed before he could talk. Every thread of the conspiracy dies with him. The ancient sources disagree. The modern historians disagree. And the most honest thing you can say 2,500 years later is this: we do not know. We know who benefited. We know who had motive. We know that the man who built a career on manipulation and controlled information was ultimately destroyed in a way that has never been fully explained. Perhaps that is the appropriate ending for Philip II of Macedon, a man who spent his entire life arranging the world so that other people's intentions were never quite visible, dying in a manner where his own death's intentions are never quite visible either. The ultimate spy, the ultimate manipulator, buried under a mystery he could not solve because he was the corpse at the centre of it. He was buried at Igi, and one of the royal tombs there was famously identified by archaeologist Manolis Andronikos in 1977 with Philip II, excavated to reveal extraordinary grave goods including gold armour, ivory sculptures, and weaponry of exceptional craftsmanship. The bones inside showed evidence of healed facial trauma consistent with the wound at Methone. The exact identification remains debated in scholarship, but the skeleton belongs to a man who had been hit very hard many times and kept moving. Alexander was king before the funeral was over. Here is what history took from Philip II of Macedon and gave to his son: the Sarissa Phalanx, the Companion Cavalry, the siege train, the professional army, the treasury of Mount Pangaean, the network of alliances across the Greek world, the blueprint for the Persian campaign, the trained generals, Parmenion, Antipater, Antigonus, who would execute that campaign at the operational level, while Alexander provided the audacity at the front. The League of Corinth, already assembled and pledged to the war, every institutional structure, every diplomatic relationship, every military innovation that Alexander would use to conquer an empire stretching from Greece to the borders of India. Alexander took all of it, and he ran. And he ran extraordinarily well. Nobody is taking that from him. He was a military genius of the first order, a commander of almost supernatural personal courage, a leader who inspired devotion in his soldiers that bordered on religious. The conquests he achieved with Philip's machine were genuinely staggering in their scale and speed. But the machine was Philip's. Demosthenes, the man who had spent 20 years warning Athens about Philip, delivered a eulogy of sorts when news of the assassination reached the city. According to his political enemies, he even dressed in celebratory white, despite the claim that his own daughter had died just days before. He told the Athenians to make offerings of thanksgiving. History has judged him harshly for this. The image of a man celebrating at the news of another's death, even an enemy's death, is uncomfortable. But Demosthenes understood, perhaps better than anyone alive, what Philip had been and what he had cost. His celebration was not joy at a man's death. It was the relief of a man who has watched an unstoppable force bearing down on everything he loved and has seen it suddenly, inexplicably stop. The relief did not last. Alexander was already moving. Philip's legacy is one of the strangest in the ancient world, a man so thoroughly overshadowed by his own creation that he nearly disappears from the story. Every biography of Alexander begins with a chapter on Philip, and then races past him to get to the good part. Every military history of the period acknowledges his innovations, and then focuses on the battles his son fought with them. He's the preface that everyone skims on the way to the main text. But the main text does not exist without the preface. The arrow does not fly without the bow. And the bow, the taut, perfectly engineered 23 years in the making bow that Philip of Macedon built out of a broken kingdom and a teenage hostage's burning ambition, was one of the most remarkable human constructions in the history of warfare. He deserved better from history than a footnote in his son's story. Hopefully today he got it. That is the story of Philip II of Macedon, the hostage who became a king, the king who became a conqueror, the conqueror who was cut down at a wedding before the world could see what he would do next. Now, I want to hear from you. Down in the comments, who do you think ordered the assassination? Was it Olympias protecting her son's throne? Was it Alexander himself, unwilling to wait? Was it the Persians eliminating the man about to invade their empire? Or was it Pausanias alone, a man with a personal grievance, a blade, and nothing left to lose? Drop your answer below. The debate has been going on for 2,000 years and nobody has settled it yet. Let's see what this community thinks. If you made it this far, you already know this channel goes deeper than the surface. Subscribe if you haven't already, share this video with someone who thinks Alexander built his own army, and check out the Wars in History playlist for more stories like this one. The next video is already in production, and if you liked this, you're going to want to be here for it. Philip II of Macedon, the mad king who built the unstoppable war machine, the greatest general nobody remembers,